on behalf of the International Society for Quality of Life Studies for joining us this webinar titled ISQOLS webinar, The Cost of Social and Environmental Degradation in Affluent Economies, presented by Dr. Giulia Slater. The monitors for this webinar, Anthony Lepentier and myself, ISQOLS VPs on online events, and will be facilitating the Q&A and serving as discussants for this session today. And now to our presenter. Giulia Slater is a research economist at the Static Research, the National Statistics Office of Luxembourg. She holds a PhD in economics from the University of Siena and is ISQOLS 2024 postdoc research fellow. Her research interests lie in the economics of happiness and social capital, and she's currently working on determining the cost of current economic systems on societies and on the environment. Giulia, thank you for accepting the offer to present today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Roger, for the introduction. And hi, everyone. It's glad to see you, so many, at the seminar today. I hope you enjoy it. So, as Roger was saying, the title of this presentation, which is also the title of the paper that I'm working on, together with Francesco Saracino, a colleague of mine at Statec, is the cost of social and environmental degradation in affluent economies. This project and this paper is part of the Wellbeing in a Sustainable Economy Revisited Horizon Wiser project. And so as part of this project, what we are trying to do is to estimate something that I now call defensive consumption, and you will see what I mean by defensive consumption in a little while during the presentation. And the aim of the presentation and the research question pretty much of the paper and what I will be presenting today is exactly this. So we're trying to estimate the costs of social and environmental degradation in high-income economies with the aim of understanding what the worth is of this degradation in modern societies. So what we are doing in this paper, our contribution is that we leverage the relationship between subjective well-being, consumption and societal bads with the aim of estimated consumption, the amount of consumption that is needed to maintain well-being unchanged in face of increasing social and environmental disruption. So what you will see in a little teaser of what you will see later is that we are estimated what we call compensating consumption, which ranges in our results to between $100 and $500 per capita per year. Again, I will get into the details of these numbers throughout the presentations, but the question is why are we doing this? So the reason is that there are, in the economy as we know it, there's reason to believe that there are profitable markets that allow people to compensate or to defend their well-being from such disruption that I was talking about. And there is little doubt about the fact that such disruption exists, and of these bads being part of the modern economic systems as we know them. So, for example, there is evidence of rises in CO2 emissions or rising material use and extractions, loss of biodiversity, soil and ocean acidifications, rising surface temperatures, and these are only a few of the examples of what we know coming from environmental studies at the moment of how unsustainable the current developmental model are at the moment. And on the social side, it is also true that long-term trends of social capital, for example, are showing declining trust and confidence in institutions. There's declining social involvement, there's increasing loneliness, increasing criminality. And the problem is that with all of these bads, people are able to defend themselves from these bads. So when people are lonely, they are able to buy home entertainment, for example, to occupy their lonely evenings at home. Or when criminality increases, people can buy insurances, or they can buy the alarm systems that are going to protect their homes. Or when pollution increases and pollution is becoming a health issue for people, they get sick and they buy the medicines, they buy air purifiers or water purifiers, and so on and so forth. You could go on with this list of examples as long as you like. But the problem is, you see here that these are all examples of how people can buy private solutions on the market to problems that are pretty much basic collective problems. And so you see how it is easier for people to defend their well-being by purchasing goods and services on the markets rather than trying to solve collective problems that then become business opportunities. And where does this idea place itself in the economic system and the economy as we know it? Well, there is a theory which is called defensive growth, for which this act of private spending to compensate one's well-being from collective issues problems is fueling even more economic growth and then creating even more negative externalities and negative the so-called negative externalities of growth. So in fact, economic growth has been typically associated with improvement in material well-being and higher standards of life, but it is also known, according to this defensive growth model, to accrue from defensive spending and to generate further externalities that further undermine common goods, such as the environment and social capital, from which people need to defend themselves. And so, economic case in this case is the results of individuals' attempts to protect themselves from the erosion of public goods, such as a good quality environment and good quality of social relations. So this idea is formalized in a theoretical model, a mathematical model, which is a defensive growth model, in which, again, you can see how this is a vicious cycle for which economic growth is both produced and it accrues from a vicious cycle whereby negative externalities are produced and fuel growth in a self-reinforcing loop. Then the problem is that when people are trying to finance their defensive consumption in order to maintain their well-being, or in general just defend themselves from these negative externalities that are in our systems as we know them, they need to work harder, which also contributes to economic growth, and they will face stronger trade-offs between working and leisure time, or between being competitive versus cooperative, which further undermines social capital, and it expands further negative externalities such as increasing stress, increasing loneliness, and more unhealthy and unhappy people. So you see how this also feeds into the vicious cycle in which negative externalities are fueling this defensive consumption and this defensive growth in a self-reinforcing loop. This model, in a way, is the explanation to why we observe that some economies, or the economies in general, growing, but there is not much or very little increase in subjective well-being, and at the same time we also observe increasing loneliness and increasing trends in pain and negative affect, for instance. And indeed, there is some evidence on the defensive growth, and I would point to the paper, actually the book chapter from Bartolini and Saracino, published last year, which is called Happiness and Ecology, in which you can find like a summary of all of the defensive growth evidence. But in short, so some of the parts of the evidence of the defensive growth model is, of course, the second part of the Easterlin paradox, which we probably all know, of the coexistence of economic growth together with flat well-being trends or very slowly increasing well-being trends in the most lucky cases. There is also evidence of the decline of social capital in periods of high economic growth. And this evidence comes both from the US, from China, but also from cross-country comparisons. And recently, actually, myself and, again, Saracino, the same co-author on this paper, we wrote a paper in which we found that economic growth is causally linked to declining social capital over time, where social capital in our paper was measured with interpersonal trust. So you see how there is evidence for economic growth to be creating some negative externalities, among which declining social capital. And then, of course, there is all of the evidence of the no decoupling between GDP growth and environmental impact in terms of both material and energy use, material footprint, and a number of other examples. And of course, the literature that shows us that the economic activity and man-made activities are inducing a lot of the climate change that we're experiencing at the moment. And then lastly, and probably more related to the presentation today and to the analysis that I'm going to show you about today, is that in another paper, we show that money compensates for poor social relationships. So in this paper, which was published a few years ago, we find that in the utility function, and in this case, which measured as subjective well-being, we find that money and social relationships were substitutes. And this is coherent with the idea of what I was showing you before, that people can buy private solutions to the collective problem of not having good quality social relations. But the problem is, and where we come in with this paper, is that we don't know exactly how much, what is the amount of the defensive consumption of this mechanism for which people can buy solutions to the decline in the social and environmental quality. And the reason for which we don't have any evidence on how much defensive consumption is that it is difficult to measure defensive consumption. And you could say, probably you could go and look at national accounts. We could, but unfortunately the problem with national accounts is that even when the information of consumption isn't large enough for us to discern and to understand exactly what the bins are for defensive consumption. So the bins of consumption that we have in national accounts aren't large enough for us to pinpoint exactly where people are spending their money in terms of defensive consumption. And similar problems really arise also from microeconomic data using, for example, survey data, because even when we wanted to, if we wanted to look at panels, there's only so many panels that are observed in the world. So we only have a limited number of countries, and ideally we would want to know a broader scope of how much defensive consumption is in a number of countries. And even when surveys do have information on consumption, it is rarely refined enough or fine-grained enough that we can actually understand where people are spending their money. And the last point is that even if we did want to create some survey questions that answer to the question of what defensive consumption is, we would in the end have to make a lot of assumptions about the questions to ask and to pinpoint where the defensive consumption is going, what are the items of defensive consumption, and then in the end we would obviously not get the full scope of the problem. So you see how measuring defensive consumption is an issue, and we would have to think about how much. We would have to think about a way of answering the question of how much is defensive consumption. So this is a framework of the theory where we place ourselves with the paper that we're presenting today, in which we exploit the compensating differential approach, which is also called the life satisfaction approach, for which we regress subjective well-being, so life satisfaction, on a number of social and environmental bads as well as consumption, in order to estimate the extra consumption needed to compensate for the subjective well-being decline due to the increasing bads. And this we will call, so this amount of extra consumption needed, the value of this extra consumption that people would be needed to spend to maintain their well-being, is what we call compensating consumption, following the literature of the compensating differential. So the life satisfaction approach has been typically used to obtain monetary valuations of non-marketable goods or bads, and so we use the same method, which has been used from a very non-extensive list of references, for example, from Pautovi and McDonald last year, but so many more papers of which we have a full reference list, of course. For example, Frey and Sutzer, these are all examples of how researchers and economists have managed to put a valuation on goods that do not have a market, so for non-marketable goods or bads in our case. And in practice, how we estimate this compensating consumption is that we use a very simple, for now, a very simple preliminary analysis, is that we regress subjective well-being at the macro level. So these are country level, this is a country level analysis. We regress average subjective well-being per country on a number of bads and on log consumption, as well as a number of controls. And this will give us an idea of what is the marginal utility or disutility, in this case, of the bads for subjective well-being. So how increasing bads is going to hamper or negatively correlate with subjective well-being, and the utility of increasing consumption. And leveraging this trade-off between the bads and consumption, we can come up with what we call compensating consumption, which is the formula that you can see here on the slide. which we compute very similarly to the literature as a formula of the willingness to accept. So we assume that people and societies need to spend money because there are some bads in the economy, and these economies are these bads are increasing, and so people need to spend some money to accept the fact that they need to defend themselves from this increase in the bads. So this is why we estimate a willingness to accept formula. And the formula is just, this is a fancy mathematical formula just to say that in the first part, which is the important part of the relation of the formula, is telling you that we are basically computing the marginal rate of substitution between the bads and consumption, and this gives us an idea of the trade-off or of the value of the bads. Then, of course, we multiply it by a standard deviation, so we have the ratio of the coefficients between the bad and consumption multiplied by some sort of change, in this case, to the standard deviation of the bads, and then we adjust for the logarithmic form of consumption for subjective well-being. And this compensating differentials, or compensating consumption, as we call it, is the extra consumption needed to maintain the level of well-being unchanged when each bad is increasing by one standard deviation. So I hope the formula is clear. If you have any questions, let me know. Although I don't see the chat, so someone's going to have to tell me if someone has questions. If not, we can do this also at the end. And then, okay, so moving to the data, hopefully the method is fair. It's quite simple. We're doing a very simple an OLS estimation. And what we do is the social bads and environmental bads that we chose to study are 4 variables for the social bads. So distress and lack of prosocial behavior, which are variables that we extract from the Gallup surveys, and these are both indexes of the shares of people who are in pain or experience worry and stress the day before, and this again is an index of the free shares. And similarly, lack of prosocial behavior is measured as an index of the share of the people who do not volunteer, don't donate, and do not help others. So the amount of people in the economy who do not engage in prosocial behaviors. Then we also measure the share of people who don't trust others and the inequality so the Gini of inequality. And then on the other side, we have the environmental bads, and for the environmental bads, we have the temperatures in degrees Celsius. So this is the levels of the temperatures of the surface of the Earth in degrees Celsius. And then we have a few measures of pollution, including the NOx, so the nitrous oxide emissions, and the PM 2.5 of air pollution in terms of mean annual exposure, because these are the variables that supposedly have a strong effect on health and so on well-being of people. And especially, these are the variables for which, first of all, we had enough good quality data that we could actually use to perform the analysis. So the variable choice was also dictated by the amount of data that we had for the countries that we are looking at. And then we have CO2 emissions, again, also a measure of pollution and an environmental degradation. I didn't mention subjective well-being is also taken from the Gallup survey. We are, in this analysis, looking at a sample of high-income countries between 2009 and 2019. And given this, I think now I would move to the results. So what we find is from the regressions, which again, I didn't mention before, we decided to estimate the two regressions, to regression equations separately. So one in which we regress the country ladder of life satisfaction, our subjective well-being measure of choice from the Gallup, first on all of the social variables together contemporaneously. And then in another separate regression, we regress subjective well-being on all of our environmental bads. And the reason for doing this is that we at first thought about regressing each variable independently, so subjective well-being on all of the variables independently. But then this would be, in our computation of the compensating consumption, it would be double counting, because, for instance, Gini, if we didn't control for trust or any of the other social variables, might be taking up some of the effect of mistrust, for example. So we thought that we would pool all the social variables together and all the environmental variables together to try and not have intersections of these effects between each other. And what we find is that all of the social bads exert a or they show a negative correlation with subjective well-being, which is statistically significant, almost always at the highest level, and the same goes for the environmental bads, although the CO2 is not significant in this case. And in terms of magnitude, just to give you an idea of how big these effects are, we find that one standard deviation increase in the Gini of inequality, which is, in our case, in our sample of high-income countries, it's about 5 points of Gini. A one standard deviation increase in the Gini is associated to a reduction in subjective well-being of 0.26 points on its 0 to 10 point scale of subjective well-being, which is roughly equivalent to the reduction in well-being of moving from the Gini of inequality in Austria to that of, to the increasing Gini of that from Austria to the one of Italy. And then one standard deviation increase in mistrust is associated to a decrease in subjective well-being by 0.15, which is similar to the effect of the temperature, for instance. Okay, so this is the regressions that we are working with. Of course, we have a number of controls, which include both micro-level controls. So, for example, we include for shares of age categories, the share of people who report to be unemployed in the survey, the shares of educational attainment in a country, the unemployment rate in the country, the inflation rate, as well as a number of macro-region dummies to account for some sort of regional characteristics that we might not be accounting for otherwise. And then we, of course, include some year dummies. And then the question with which we started the paper is, as if you remember, we are trying to estimate how much societies value these bads, both social and environmental. So how much money would people be, or society would be willing to accept to spend in order to defend themselves from a standard deviation increase in each of these bads. And the way we compute this and what we find is the formula that I showed you earlier, the willingness to accept formula to compute the compensating consumption. And you see here an example of how we computed it exactly in terms for the Gini in this case. And we find that the compensating consumptions for the whole period range between $337 per capita for CO2 to around $3,000 for the Gini. But these are over the 10-year period, 9 or 10, depending on how many years we observe the variable for. And when we divide them by the number of years, of course, we get the yearly compensating consumption. And we find that these range between around 100, it was 33 for the CO2, 100 for NOx, and 390 for the Gini. So this is, the interpretation of this is the value that societies place on each of these bads and how much they would be willing to spend in order to defend themselves from an increase on each of these bads by one standard deviation. So in terms of how we place ourselves in terms of results and of magnitude of these compensating consumptions in the literature, we find that our results are quite similar to comparable cross-country studies from other studies that also use cross-country comparisons on macro data. And there is, again, this is a non-extensive list of people who have studied something similar to us. And again, they find that the compensating differentials in this case range between $70 per capita for NO2 increases. So this is a willingness to accept. And in terms of willingness to pay instead, again, the compensating differentials range between $750 and $1,400, $460 for PM reduction, and so on and so forth. So we place ourselves very similarly to the environmental studies that we find in the literature. The social variable seems to be a little bit higher, which was also the case in our study. But the big difference that we find is also from the literature, so not only in terms of our paper, is that if we, in studies that have used panel microdata on individual countries, the compensating differentials are much, much higher. And the differences, I think I attribute this difference to the fact that with individual level data, you are more able to capture the heterogeneity of people's preferences. And when you aggregate when you take the averages and you aggregate at the country level, then you have shorter scales of our variables of interest, both in terms of subjective well-being and independent variables on the right-hand side of the equations. And so, of course, the computation, the mathematical computation of the compensating differentials is clearly much lower. And then the other reason for which ours are slightly smaller is that because, as I told you earlier, our regression is an equation of subjective well-being on consumption and the bads, whereas in the literature, it is mostly always, we found, a regression of subjective well-being on some sort of good or bad and income. So we also did, we did this test. We wondered whether it would be similar in terms of results if we then estimated the compensating differential value, which in this case would be a compensating income value, by regressing subjective well-being on the same set of bads that I showed you earlier and income as well. And we find that, again, with the same formula, the compensating incomes are a little bit larger per year, but again, so at this point, even more similar potentially to the literature of what I just showed you before. So the compensating income in this case, which is the interpretation of which is how much money would be people willing to accept to face an increase in one standard deviation of the bad, range between $308 for CO2 per CO2 emissions, and around 1,000 for Gini, and all the range in between. Okay, so how much is this worth in the economies? These are the values of how much people would be willing to spend on, or would be willing to accept in terms of income to defend themselves from their well-being, but what is their worth in the economy? So to answer this question, we tried a very simple accounting exercise, so to speak, for which we get the unit value of each of these bads by dividing the compensating income per year, so the second column that you see here, by the standard deviation of each bad. And this unit value is giving the value of, so the monetary value of 1 unit of each of these bads. So the monetary value of 1 unit of Gini is $193. The unit value of 1% of people in the economy not trusting others is $38, and so on and so forth. And if we multiply these values by the stock of observed bads in our sample, then we can obtain what we call the expected compensating consumption or expected compensating income, because we did it in both cases, both with the compensating consumption and in the compensating income case. And what we see here is that the amount of expected compensating consumption, which is, again, the monetary value that we just estimated multiplied by the stock of the bad that we observed in the economy in our sample, ranges for about $5,500 for the social bads in terms of expected compensating consumption, and around 1,000 for the environmental bads. Whereas in terms of expected compensating income, the expected compensating income for the environmental bads is around 1,500, 15,000, whereas, sorry, that's a typo, and around 2,000 for environmental bads. And what does this mean? The idea here is that if, under the very strong assumption that people spend exactly what they value, so the last column that we found in this table, if society spent exactly what they value on each on the bad, and given the amount of bads that we find in the economy, and they defended themselves from all of the variables, from all of these bads contemporaneously, the expected compensating consumption would be around 20% of the observed consumption that we had. And in terms of income, it would mean that the defensive growth in this case, if you will, would be around 40% of the observed GDP of the period. So the shares are quite large. But there is obviously also, as you can see, a stark difference between the expected compensating consumption and the expected compensating income. And we attribute this difference to the fact that income allows to buy both the consumption of this moment as well as the consumption in the future. So if people are worried that the future is also going to be bleak or even bleaker than what we have at the moment, they would need more income to also face consumption in the future. So in a sense, income is buying hope. And this is coherent with another study that we, from a study from Emma Pleeging, published a few years ago, in which she also finds that income buys hope, in the sense that in the utility function of individuals in terms of life satisfaction, income exerts a strong positive effect on well-being. But when controlling for, so when in a mediation analysis, when she also controls for hope, she finds that income doesn't exert as big of an effect, meaning that when we don't control for hope, income is buying all of that part that hope is attributing to well-being. So income is allowing you to buy hope for the future, for example. So we think that the explanation for which expected compensating income is higher than expected compensating consumption would be with the importance of incomes in terms of saving or buying hope. And so with this, actually, I will move to the conclusions. What we did in this paper is that we estimated the consumption needed to maintain well-being unchanged in face of increasing social and environmental disruption. So we estimated a value of the disruption that we find in the economy. And we find that this value, the compensating consumption value, ranges between $100 and $500 per capita per year, depending on the bad. And under the assumption, as I get the fairly strong assumption that if society spent exactly what they value for each of the bad, and given the amount of bad in the economy, then the expected consumption of the period would be around $6,000, which is 20% of the observed consumption of the period. And why is this important? Why do we think that this is relevant? Well, because if GDP, as we have seen, is made up both by the GDP that is defensive, that D stands for defensive, and a part of GDP that isn't defensive, this doesn't make it a good measure of progress. So our findings highlight that there is a significant part of GDP, 40% if you buy our results, that isn't. That is given from this defensive mechanism of people trying to defend their well-being from social and environmental bads. And this is obviously not a good measure of progress, because it's an indication perhaps of the systemic failures of how we are not able to solve the collective action problems, but it's easier for us to buy private solutions instead. And so probably a good measure of progress would be measuring subjective well-being or quality of life, and how we would obtain it in economic and social systems, and how we can sustainably achieve it. So in a way, a growth that isn't defensive, a growth that doesn't include this part of defense of people defending their well-being from the negative externalities and from common problems, would be indeed slower, but it would be better fit to support quality of life, and they would benefit both the natural and the social environment, because we wouldn't have all of the negative externalities that we have seen in the defensive growth model of earlier. And so recognizing that there is a defensive part, there is a defensive component to consumption and to growth, can in a way inform policy, because if we invested in public goods and especially prevention and maintenance of collective goods, rather than coping and repair, then we would have a better measure of GDP, and perhaps a better measure of progress. With this, I'm finished, actually. So sorry, I don't have the thank you slide, but thank you for everyone for being here. And I'm ready and glad.
Thank you, Giulia. Thank you very much, Giulia. Like for me, I mean, I think you know, I've heard about this defensive growth and defensive consumption for a while, so I'm happy to finally see it in motion, incarnated into numbers. So thank you very much for this presentation. So now this is time for the Q&A. We have about like 20 minutes. So that's cool. During your talk, you receive a number of questions, Giulia. So I'm going to start reading some for you because actually they are somehow overlapping with my own questions. And so once again, I would just invite our audience to raise their virtual hand if ever they want to ask directly a question to Giulia. So the first question I will come back to, Giulia, is the one of Veronica Vienne. And somehow Roger also echoed this question. It's the following. I wanted to ask you if you have tried to run the regression with a subsample of smaller area countries. And then Roger went also in the realm of heterogeneity by thinking about potentially the social origins of the countries. So is this something you have tried, investigated?
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the questions. I think I have myself a question for Veronica. I don't know if it's easier to turn on the mic. What do you mean with smaller area countries? Are you thinking a smaller sample or just smaller countries because they might have different characteristics? Because if that's what you're asking, no, we didn't. For now, it's kind of also very preliminary. So the analysis is very early on in its stages. For now, we use only high income countries. And in whatever we found in the data set, so we didn't really, we haven't looked at the social origins of the countries, no, but I guess that would make, it could make a difference in the way that societies within each country react to defending their well-being. So that's, yeah, that's a good point. In terms of heterogeneity, we have, I guess I could show you the results. Are not great because they're also, we've done them very, very quickly. We divided, so within the sample of high-income countries that we have, we did them by macro regions. Again, a very preliminary attempt of macro regions. So we did Europe and Central Asia, North America, Middle East and North Africa, Asia and Latin America and Caribbean. But again, we have a very small number of countries in some of these regions. So we didn't really do it in terms of interactions. But these graphs are telling you, given the stock of the bads per each of the macro regions, so to speak, the average, the average bad of the period in these macro regions, this is how much they would be spending. So we find some sort of difference, but not that much, except for Middle East and North Africa. They seem to be spending a lot. They would be spending, let's say, they place a lot of value on the environmental bads, and this is one of the heterogeneities that we've found. But again, this is quite preliminary, so we will have to look into a little bit more of this heterogeneity.
Veronica, please, I see that you turn on your mic and the camera.
Yeah. Hi, Giulia. Thank you so much for the presentation. I really enjoyed it. So about the question, so I meant smaller areas. Like smaller, physically smaller countries, because you have like all the environmental measures at country level, yes. Meaning that you will have you're bound to have quite a bit of aggregation in them. And one way to get around it with the data that you've got would be to do such thing to see like how the results change, or maybe something. It could also be with maybe population density. Or something like that.
That's a good point. Actually, I had originally thought to divide our variables by population, and I did it very fast, and I don't think there was much difference. Ideally, I haven't done it yet because I don't have the data at hand. We would like to repeat this analysis at the regional level, so within the same sample of countries that we have, but do it at a less aggregate level, so that we would find more of an effect, especially for the environmental variables. I agree that we would find probably a little bit more of an effect and an importance on well-being if we manage to localize people to where actually the pollution and the disruption is. So that's something that we would like to do when I get the regional data. So when I manage to link the regional people to where they live and get the aggregates of well-being for the region. And so
and I think there is something linked also to urbanization, population density, because I think the whole concept of defensive growth and defensive consumption is somehow more salient in cities than in urban or in rural area. I would imagine. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's my.
No, yeah, you're right, definitely. Actually, urbanization would be, I think, a fairly easy control to include in the regression. So
yeah, no, I'm thinking about Singapore. I mean, in Singapore, you are basically surrounded by consumption potential everywhere, and in some countries that are wider and less dense in terms of population, maybe defensive consumption is less of a thing. Although with new technology, I mean, everybody can connect on Amazon and buy stuff. So, but
okay, maybe I'll get back to this point. We'll go through the other results, the questions, and then
yes. There is another one from Youngwon Song, and I'm very, very grateful for the question because I'm usually the one asking this kind of questions. So this is not my fault. Have you tried including country fixed effect, 1, and 2? What about clustering standard errors at the country level instead of the country time year?
Okay, so the cluster of the errors I haven't thought about. I have to admit, I just went directly to, but that's a good point. I could try that. And for the country fixed effects, we did it. Yes, we did it. The results aren't as great with the panel, I have to admit. But I think it makes sense that there isn't, because we have a fairly short time series, and in which, so we only have 10 years of observations here, and the variation in both subjective well-being and our BADs isn't really that much. So we are eliminating the source of variation when we do the fixed effects. So even though the signs are quite coherent, there's always a negative effect of the BADs on subjective well-being, especially for the social BADs, a little bit less so for the environmental BADs. They're very rarely statistically significant, and I think it makes sense. I guess this is it makes sense because we are reducing the variation, the very variation that we're trying to look at when we do fixed effects. And also one other problem that we have, unfortunately, with the data is that because the panel is very unbalanced, we don't have the same number of observations year per country. So some countries are only observed, for example, twice, whereas others are observed 9 or 10 times. This would also make the time variations when you do the within estimation, when you do fixed effects, then obviously it's going to be different, and so that complicates also the interpretation. So we're working on it. We're working on fixed effects, but for the cluster of the errors, I will try that. Well, I mean, so at the country level, yes.
Exactly. Yeah, I think I had the same comment about the clusters. So yeah, that's definitely something I would try. So I'm going to alternate a little bit. We still have a couple of questions in the chat, but I saw that Lucas has his hand raised now for a while. So Lucas, please, if you can just unmute yourself and turn on your camera, the floor is yours.
Hi. So yeah, thank you. Very interesting concept. I didn't hear about it. I was just typing into and I've had some results on how to spend money on the military. So I was just wondering. I think I don't get I need a bit more information on the concept. So I guess this is related to the concept of Veblen goods or something like luxury goods, or which basically have a detrimental effect because you basically buy stuff only because to keep up with the Jones, it's about social comparison. I guess, I mean, that's all I think there are many also negative things thinking of consumption in general, but so I was just trying to grab these thoughts on like how you think of externalities, and I think I would have to dig a bit in the paper, but maybe you can illustrate a bit more on this. Thanks.
Sure. So an easy answer, and then I'll give you the longer answer, is that if you want a very good starting point for the defensive consumption and defensive growth, the paper that I cited in the defensive consumption literature from Bartolini and Stefano has a very good explanation of what defensive consumption is. But I will give you the answer now in short if I manage. So defensive consumption is all of the efforts of individuals to try and defend their well-being from some sort of negative amount of bads, of disruption there is in the economy, whether it is produced by economic growth or not. People still need to defend themselves from the pollution that they are breathing, from the fact that they don't trust their neighbors, or from mounting criminality, and so on and so forth. So these are only very few examples, but you can see how the point is defending these bads are going to create disutility in your utility function. So they're going to decrease your utility, and you're trying to defend your utility by spending. So it's not, I see it's closely related, but not exactly from the Veblen goods of and on keeping up with the Joneses. On the Joneses, that's true, but that's a different kind of consumption. It still might be bad for well-being, because it has also been shown, I think, that Veblen goods have a negative effect on well-being, because you're in terms of social comparisons are never good for your well-being. And people might defend themselves by buying even more goods for defending themselves from social comparisons, but this is not exactly. I think I overcomplicated it. The point of defensive consumption is defending yourself in whatever way, consuming from something that causes a disutility in your utility function.
Okay.
Whatever this is. Everyone is going to spend in a different way because of the different bads that he is facing. So I hope that this is the short answer. Yes.
And Giulia, if I may, I'm going just to steer you in somehow a direction that is linked to what you just talked about. One of the questions in the chat is about whether you could explain a little bit better, or maybe with a more concrete example, the link between defensive consumption and how it leads to scarce social relationships, social relations.
Okay, let me maybe pull up the graph again, if that's.
And while Giulia put the graph, let me just say that Kelsey kindly put in the chat one of the papers that Giulia was referring to about defensive consumption. So if you want some more material.
Thank you. Thanks, Kelsey, for the reference. The question was how defensive consumption can relate to scarcity of social relations. Well, one link, and I guess the easiest one for me to explain and to think about, is that I guess it's rather intuitive, if you need to spend more because you need to defend yourself, but in general, if you need to spend more, you need the money to spend. And then one mechanism via which this defensive spending makes your social relation decreases, because you're going to have a trade-off between how much money you devote to working instead of spending time with others, which is one of the mechanisms via which social capital increases. So spending time with others is actually itself a measure of social capital. But also there is evidence that points to if you need more income, if you want higher wages, you're probably going to be you will try harder to perform better and to be more productive at work. And one of the ways in which you might be more productive at work is to be more competitive rather than cooperative, which is also going to reduce your social capital and your social relations. So this is one way of linking the defensive spending, defensive consumption to decreasing social relations. If I have other examples, I will let you know. I hope this was.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So I'm not from economics background. I'm sorry if I'm wrong. If I'm asking a very, very silly question. So when you mean defensive consumption, it doesn't involve anything that a person needs, is it? Like, does defensive consumption also include food, clothing, shelter? It could be.
No. The idea is that this is not trying to meet. This is not consumption towards basic needs. This is consumption that you do because something is creating a disutility in your well-being function. So something is causing a disruption to your well-being, and you try to spend to defend yourself from it. I mean, if for some reason the disruption is causing you not to be able to buy food, then I guess it would be defensive, but that's a very blurry line that, especially in our sample, if I bring it back to the paper that we're looking at, it's very unlikely that defensive consumption in this case is trying to beat basic need. And actually, one of the reasons for which we look at defensive consumption is only in high-income countries is that we assume that in high-income countries, basic needs are already met, and there's no utility gain from basic needs consumption. The utility gains are usually going to be from defensive consumption. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I feel it's little bit. Yeah, I understand a little bit more.
It's usually not basic need spending.
Right,
The short answer is yes. No.
Thank you. Yeah. And also, coming from a management point of view, so you're saying consumption is making employees, I mean, whoever it is, to work more, right? So where do we actually stop this? I mean, we can see all of us can see this kind of circle going on, but where is the where do you think is the right place to intervene? I mean, with little effort, or which is the lowest hanging apple that we can actually catch hold of?
Okay, that's a very good question.
Giulia, I would just invite you to give a short response so that we can address the last point, and then.
Okay, so it's not a low-hanging fruit, but probably the one that would have the biggest payoff for me is trying to cut off the cycle at the production of negative externalities, and especially trying to tackle collective actions together, so making it a collective action problem so that people manage to cooperate towards a corrective action rather than engage in the defensive spending. But this is by no means the simple and low-hanging fruit. I think I don't have an answer for the low-hanging fruit, but I think this is the most effective way of stopping the cycle.
Sure. Thank you.
But happy to
talk
about
by the way. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll catch up. Yeah.
Thanks.
So, Giulia, we have one question from Enrico, who wanted to ask you if the specification of the well-being function or the well-being regression is proposed ad hoc for this research, or more in general, how it is usually specified in the literature. And I think here we're talking about the well-being valuation technique.
You mean
your regression, like how standard this regression is to do this exercise?
Well, I would say fairly standard. I mean, correct me. Some other well-being person in the audience, correct me if I'm wrong, this is quite standard. The only unstandard thing that I would say is that we're trying to estimate compensating differential with consumption rather than with income, which is usually pretty much in 100% of the cases what I've seen. So the only new thing, the new thing that we're introducing in this equation is that we are regressing subjective well-being on the BADs and then on consumption rather than on income. But in terms of well-being function, that's not an issue, I would say. It's a little bit of a different interpretation in terms of compensating differential, which is not compensating income, but it's compensating consumption. So the amount of money that people would be willing to accept to spend, rather than the amount of money that people would be willing to accept just as extra income to face the bad. But the subjective well-being equation is pretty standard. Yes, definitely.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like it is indeed standard, and that's what I like a lot actually about this regression is the consumption part, which I'm not sure I have seen in another paper.
If you have, let me know because I haven't.
No, I don't. I don't think so either. So for me, like the only thing that is somewhat new in this model is consumption, and that's actually what makes it unique in a way. Yeah. So that's really cool. Okay, we are getting close, close to the end. So I'm going to thank you again, Giulia. Thank you very much for this great talk. Kelsey, I mean, you are entitled to a very, very short question, but only because it's you.
Thanks. Giulia, did I share the right paper? Happier and Sustainable Possibilities for a Post-Growth. That's the one most recent by Stefano and Francesco.
I was actually, and I think you still see my screen, referring to this book chapter in Handbook of Labor, Human Resources and whatnot, Happiness Economy.
Happiness and ecology. Okay, so apologies, everyone. I shared the wrong paper. So it should still have plenty of references.
Probably,
but, now you see the paper that was intended.
And I guess the list, the authors are still good, so that's fine. I mean, from one paper to another, you can make your own links. Everything's totally fine. So again, thank you very much, Giulia. Jill.
Thank you for having me.
Jill, if you have some concluding remarks.
That was great, Giulia. Thank you so much. I know we always get questions from people who watch these webinars, and I'm wondering if we can share your email in our follow-up message from our participants.
I will also send you the slides. I will just put them in a PDF form rather than PowerPoint, so that people, no notes flying about. I will do that now.
There might be questions about, what is needed to support development of non-defensive growth models. There might be questions about future research and how they can potentially collaborate with you. So if you did participate in this, I will be glad to send you Giulia's contact information as well as the slides and the webinar that will be posted on our YouTube page shortly. And we hope to see all of you, which Giulia will be at the Luxembourg conference, right, Giulia?
I will be, and I will probably be presenting again.
That's right, attend in person and ask me your questions at our upcoming Luxembourg conference this summer, July 22nd to the 25th. The early bird registration deadline is 15th of April, coming up very, very quickly. So please do register, and we hope to see you all there. Thank you so much, Giulia, and thank you everyone for participating.
Thank you for having me. It was great.
Thank you.
See you soon. Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much. Bye.